بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما. Last week we spoke about the situation of Philistine after World War I and how the British took over control of Philistine and they promised the Jews that they would be able to establish a homeland for themselves in Philistine. We spoke about the Churchill White Paper, which was a British policy statement that was drafted under the order of Winston Churchill, who at that time was the British colonial secretary, meaning he was the one who was in charge of the states or the lands that were colonized by England. So Winston Churchill, he had this paper drafted that became known as the Churchill White Paper. And that was in 1922. And this paper contained a promise to uphold the Balfour Declaration. And we spoke about the Balfour Declaration earlier, which was a British promise that the Jews would be able to establish themselves in Philistine. So this Churchill White Paper reiterated the Balfour Declaration, and it recommitted the British government to the Balfour Declaration. They say that we still support this declaration, we still support the Jews establishing their homeland in Philistine. So basically they reiterated their support for the Jews to establish themselves in Philistine and to freely immigrate into Philistine and make settlements in Philistine. And of course, the Arabs were furious with this because during this time, the Arabs were trying to negotiate with the British, trying to get their rights back for their land. But then the British, they issued this statement reiterating their support for the Balfour Declaration and reiterating their support for Jews to establish a homeland in Philistine. So the Arabs were betrayed by the British once again. So you see, this is a pattern now. The British, they betray everyone, not only the Arabs, they betrayed everyone, but the Arabs were betrayed again and again and again in succession, right? So of course they were furious with this. And that same year in 1922, the 5th Palestine Arab Congress was held. So every year, the Arabs, they would have this conference that was known as the Palestine Arab Conference. So the 5th one was held in 1922 and it was held in Nablus. And the Arabs, of course, in their conference, they spoke about the situation of Philistine and they announced that they would continue their efforts to gain independence for Philistine, and they would continue working towards Arab unity. The Arabs have to be united if we want to get our lands back. So they spoke about this and they tried to make some plans regarding this. And of course the Arabs, they rejected the idea of Jewish immigration into Philistine in any form. One thing that they were all agreed upon was that the Jews cannot continue to immigrate into Philistine. And they still had hopes. Even after all of this betrayal by the British, the Arabs, they still were holding out hope that if they continued diplomacy with the British, if they continued their diplomatic efforts with the British, that perhaps this will lead somewhere. They were still thinking that there was hope in diplomacy. Now, Britain, in order to calm down the Arab tensions, they saw that the Arabs were getting more and more mad, and they feared that if this Arab anger reaches a boiling point, it would lead to revolutions and it would lead to a lot of problems for the British. So the British, in order to quell these Arab tensions, they decided to establish a parliament in Philistine. That, okay, let the Palestinians have their own parliament composed of their own people, right? That will make them happy. It will give them a semblance of independence. They will think that they have some form of independence if we allow them to form their own parliament. So the British allowed the Palestinians to formulate a parliament, but the British put restrictions on this parliament. The British, they put their own rules and their own conditions on this parliament. One of the rules was that this parliament has no right to object to British rule. They cannot object to the British mandate at all. That's off limits. And also, this Palestinian parliament has no right to object to the Balfour Declaration. They cannot object to the British promise to the Jews to establish a homeland in Palestine. The parliament cannot object to that. Also, this Palestinian parliament has no right to object to Jewish immigration into Palestine. The Jews will still be able to freely migrate and settle in Palestine, and this parliament cannot do anything about it. And in addition to that, this parliament has no say in any financial matters. They have nothing to do with the economy, nothing to do with the budget. They cannot involve themselves in any financial matters at all. So then what is this parliament if it can't do any of these things? It was basically a puppet council of 23 members. And out of these 23, 10 out of those 23 were Arabs. Even though the Arab population of Palestine was 90%, even in that puppet parliament that they made, only 10 of the members of that parliament were Arabs, right? So look at the British and look at how evil they are. But they tried to do this just to calm down the Arab tensions. And the Jews, of course, they welcomed this parliament. They were very happy. This is a good idea, a good parliament. They were happy with it. The Jews were happy with it. But the majority of Arabs, of course, they saw it for what it was and they rejected it. Now, while these political movements and these games were taking place, there was also a small individual movement that was started by one person, and that movement ended up having a huge impact on Palestinian history. And the person who started this movement was a Shaikh, a great scholar. His name was Izzuddin al-Qassam. Izzuddin al-Qassam. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala have mercy upon him. Rahmatullahi alayh. Izzuddin al-Qassam, he was a great Islamic scholar originally from Syria. He was born in Syria in the year 1883. And he was a mujahid as well. He was a scholar and he was a mujahid. He resisted the French occupation of Syria and he fought against the French colonizers for 3 consecutive years. 1918, 1919, and 1920. He was at the forefront fighting against the French. And he was actually sentenced to death by France because he stood against the French colonization of Syria. In the end, the French sentenced him to death. So he had to flee from Syria. And he ended up seeking refuge in Palestine. He came to Palestine and he settled in a small village near Haifa. And he became the Shaykh of that village because he was a very knowledgeable man. He became the Shaykh of that village. He became an Imam and a Khatib in this village near Haifa. And he started to teach Islam in the surrounding areas. And he actually gained a very wide popularity and he gained a very wide following in Palestine. He became very popular. All right. In the year 1925, the Hebrew University in Jerusalem was completed. This university was established after World War I in 1918, and the construction was finally completed in 1925. So the grand opening of the university, the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, is basically a university for Jews that was built with the support of the British, right? So the grand opening for this university was in 1925. And to attend the grand opening ceremony of this university in Jerusalem, the former British Foreign Secretary, Arthur Balfour himself, this is a person who is despised by the Arabs because he's the author of the Balfour Declaration. The Arabs hate him, right? He himself came into Palestine in 1925 for the grand opening of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. So when Balfour came into Palestine, of course, the Arabs, they got very angry, and because of this, protests started all across Palestine against the visit of Arthur Balfour, and of course also against the opening of the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. The Jews are establishing their own university in Jerusalem. This is Muslim Arab land, and the Jews are establishing their university right there. right? So of course this is something that made the Muslims, it made the Arabs angry. So protests began after this. So during these protests in 1925, the Shaykh Izzuddin al-Qassam, rahmatullahi alayh, he declared that, look, there is no hope for any diplomatic solutions with the British. You know, this diplomacy, trying to talk to them, trying to negotiate with them, there's no hope in any of that. We have seen time and time again, that just doesn't work with these people. So there's no solution with these British and with these Jews, except the only solution is armed resistance. We have to fight against them. We have to actually fight jihad against these people. So Shaykh Izzuddin al-Qassam, rahmatullahi alayh, he founded the Islamic jihad movement in Palestine in the year 1925. He actually formed a jihad movement. And the slogan of this jihad movement was هذا جهاد نصر أو استشهاد, that this is our jihad, either we will be victorious or we will die as martyrs. No surrender, basically. هذا جهاد نصر أو استشهاد. This was the slogan of this movement. Now during this same time period, there was another movement that had originated in Egypt. It was known as Jam'iyyat Shubban al-Muslimin, the Egyptian Muslim Youth Association, right? This movement actually had branched out and established branches in Palestine as well. And they announced that they wanted the Shaykh Izzuddin al-Qassam to be their president as well, right? So now Shaykh Izzuddin al-Qassam, he became the president of the Egyptian Muslim Youth Association, and he was also the head of his own jihad movement that he founded. So Shaykh Izzuddin al-Qassam, rahmatullahi alayhi, he became the symbol of jihad, and he became the symbol of the Islamic movement in Palestine. Now at the same time, diplomatic efforts were still continuing with others. Izzuddin al-Qassam, he said that, you know, these diplomatic efforts will not work. But there were others who felt that diplomacy still had a chance. And amongst those who still hoped that diplomatic efforts could be successful, amongst those who were trying in that way, was the Shaykh Al-Hajj Amin Al-Husayni, rahmatullahi alayhi, who was the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, the Mufti of Palestine. He still had hope that perhaps some peaceful solutions through diplomacy with the British may come about. He was still hoping for that. All right, in the year 1928, the seventh and the final conference of the Palestine Arab Congress took place in the year 1928, the seventh Congress and the final one. And in this general meeting, the Arabs again, they continued to demand that the British abandon this Zionist project, abandoned their support for the Jews to come into Palestine and establish a homeland in Palestine. They demanded that the British leave this off and give Palestine to the Arabs. This is the land of the Arabs and it belongs to the Arabs. But of course, Britain, they did not pay any attention to these Arab demands. Then some very serious events occurred. The Jews had the audacity to attack Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa. They attacked Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa in the year 1928. And they occupied the western side of Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa at Ha'it Buraq, the Buraq wall, the western wall of the Masjid Al-Aqsa compound. And the Jews claim that this wall belongs to them. The Jews claim that this wall belongs to the Jews, the western wall. Right? It was all part of Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa compound, and the Jews now are saying that they have a right to one side of that, to one wall of that. So of course, this is something the Muslims would not accept. How can they take over part of Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa? This is something the Muslims would not accept. So a major revolution erupted in Palestine in 1929 due to this incident. And that was known as the Buraq Revolution. It was known as the Buraq Revolution because it was due to the Jews taking over Ha'it Buraq, the wall of Buraq, which is the western wall of Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa compound. So this revolution, it spread throughout Palestine. Over 100 Jews were killed, over 300 were injured. And then of course the Jews themselves, they could not fight back. They did not have the capacity or the power or the strength to fight against the Muslims. So the British, they are the ones who got involved instead. So the British once again suppressed this revolution and they killed over 100 Arabs and they injured more than 200. Then after crushing this revolution, instead of calming things down, instead of trying to calm down the tensions, the British in the year 1930, they executed the main leaders of the Buraq revolution. The Arab leaders, the Muslim leaders of that revolution, the main leaders were executed, and the other leaders, the remaining leaders, were given imprisonment sentences for life, right? And after the British suppressed this revolution, they could see, like, look, tensions are very high now. This has reached a boiling point. It has passed the boiling point. But the British, what was their response to this? They crushed the revolution, and then they actually allowed for an increase in Jewish immigration into Palestine. More Jews now can come into Palestine. So of course, after this, the hostility of the Arabs towards the British and towards the Jews, it increased a lot, and justifiably so, of course, right? The Arabs, they had initially hoped that Britain would help them establish their state, right? During World War I, the British made the Arabs all sorts of promises, and they broke all of those promises. So now the Arabs were finally waking up and beginning to realize that the British had betrayed them. The British, how they handed Syria and Lebanon to France, and how now they were establishing a homeland for the Jews in the heart of Palestine. This is betrayal after betrayal after betrayal from the British to the Arabs. And the Arabs were now finally starting to realize this, that these people, it's no use trying to negotiate with them. They will just betray us again and again and again. And especially the youth, right? The youth became very enthusiastic to establish jihad in the way of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? There was a lot of enthusiasm amongst the youth to join movements for jihad in the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So large numbers started to now join every movement that called for jihad fi sabilillah, right? Now in the meantime, Jewish immigration into Palestine, it continued. The Jewish settlements continued, and the British, they started arming the Jews as well. They started providing the Jews in Palestine with weapons as well, right? Now during this period, there was a group of Muslim leaders led by the great Mujahid Shaikh Arsalan, rahmatullahi alayh, from Lebanon. And this leader, this Mujahid Shaikh Arsalan from Lebanon, he was a great writer, right? He wrote a very famous book called Hadir al-Alam al-Islami. Hadir al-Alam al-Islami, which basically means the situation of the Islamic world today, right? And this is a great book. In this book, Shaikh Arsalan, he analyzed the situation of the Islamic world, and he gave a very deep analysis of his vision for the future of the Islamic world. And he saw the danger and the evil of the British and the Jewish plan for Palestine. So he was a great thinker, an analytical thinker, and he was able to gather a group of Muslim leaders, and they held secret meetings to announce a plan for jihad. They held secret meetings to announce a plan for jihad, not only to save Palestine, but to also save the other colonized lands of the Arabs, right? So they got together and they started having these discussions and formulating a plan to free the Arab lands from colonial rule. So a plan was formulated to liberate Syria and Palestine under the leadership of Shaikh Arsalan, and Al-Hajj Sheikh Amin Al-Husseini, the Mufti of Palestine, he agreed to be part of this plan. And a large number of leaders participated in these talks to formulate these plans, right? And not only Arabs, right? The participation in these talks even reached India. Maulana Shaukat Ali, who was a leader of the Islamic movement in India, he even took part in these talks. The Palestinian issue, it was not only an issue for the Arabs, but it is an Islamic issue, because that land, that is holy land. It is not holy only for the Arabs, it is holy for all of the Muslims, right? So they came up with this idea, they formulated a plan, but because of the lack of resources on their end, and because of the strong colonial control of those lands, and also due to some deficiencies in their own planning as well, this plan did not succeed. These talks, they formulated a plan, but the plan was not able to move forward. Then, in the year 1931, the General Islamic Conference was held in Jerusalem. A big Islamic conference was held in Jerusalem. And the purpose of this conference was to basically alert the whole Islamic Ummah, to alert the whole Muslim world, not just the Arabs, to establish the issue of Philistine not only as an Arab issue, but as an issue for all Muslims and an issue of Islam, right? So this big conference was held in Jerusalem in the year 1931 under the leadership and under the invitation of a Shaykh al-Hajj Amin al-Husseini, the Mufti of Jerusalem. So he invited leaders from the Islamic world, not only the Arab world, but the whole Islamic world. He invited people to come and attend this conference. So representatives from 22 Arab and other Islamic countries attended this conference. So not only Arabs, but non-Arabs from the Muslims attended this conference as well. Many prominent figures of the time attended. Amongst those who attended this conference in 1931 in Jerusalem, amongst those who attended was Sheikh Muhammad Rashid Rida, who was the famous Lebanese Sheikh who was now settled in Egypt. Also, the great philosopher and poet of the Indian subcontinent, Muhammad Iqbal, he attended this conference. Also, the leader of the Islamic movement in India, Maulana Shaukat Ali, he attended. Also, the Tunisian Islamic leader, Abdul Aziz al-Tha'alibi, he attended as well. Also, the former Prime Minister of Iran, Ziyauddin Tabtabai, he also attended, and others as well. So it had representation from all over the Muslim world. So during the discussions in this conference in Jerusalem in 1931, a committee was formed to investigate the issues between the Arabs and the Jews, right? Who is the cause for these revolts and this fighting that has been taking place amongst the Arabs and the Jews in Philistine? So this committee, it was called the International Buraq Committee, to investigate, and the goal of this committee was to investigate the cause of the Buraq revolution, right? That Buraq revolution was the revolution that occurred after the Jews took over the western wall of Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa, right? So this committee, their job was to investigate the root causes behind this revolution and who was responsible for this revolution. Who is at fault for the fighting that was caused? So the committee investigated the matter and it issued its decision that the Buraq wall, it belongs solely to the Muslims. It is part of Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa compound. It belongs to the Muslims and the Jews have no right to it and the Jews have no share to it. So this was one of the declarations that was made, right? So now Britain found itself in a problem because this international committee, right, it had declared that the right of Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa, including that western wall, it belongs to the Muslims, and it declared that the Jews are at fault. They are the ones who instigated the events that led to the Buraq revolution, right? Because they took over that western wall, which they had no right to do. So they are the ones who instigated the event that led to this revolution, right? So the British, instead of accepting this report and trying to make rectifications for what happened, what do you think the British did? They dismissed the report. They didn't pay any attention to this report. And again, the British reiterated their support for the Jews, declaring once again that the Jews have a right to establish a homeland for themselves in the land of Philistine. After this, of course, the cycle, it started again. Revolts erupted again in Philistine. And the British again confronted these revolts with its military. And they were able to capture and arrest a number of the leaders of this latest revolt, and they exiled them out of Philistine, right? So again, it's just the same thing happening again and again and again. So now after this, at this point, the Mufti of Jerusalem, Shaykh al-Hajj Amin al-Husseini rahmatullahi alayh, up to this point, he had still hoped that diplomacy could work. But then after this, now he declared like, look, okay, we tried our best with diplomacy, but there's no hope anymore for a diplomatic solution. And he declared, the Mufti of Philistine, Al-Hajj Amin al-Husseini, he declared that the only way forward now is jihad. fighting in the way of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And we'll talk a little bit more about that next week bi'idhnillah. جزاكم الله خيرا وبارك الله فيكم والله أعلم وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala barakatuh. If you guys have a car in the basement, please move it. I am closing the garage in the basement. If you guys have a car in the basement, please move it. Barakallahu feekum. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.